steps if it won the election. Sir Keir Starmer promised to promote economic stability and invest in the NHS. He'd also set up a new national energy company, which one report claims today would need up to £82 billion of investment in the first decade. The Shadow Environment Secretary, Steve Reed, has been asked by LBC if that's true.
It may well be. Like I said, this isn't supposed to be a delivery plan for GB Energy. This is just a first step and a declaration that Labour will be setting up GB Energy. You'll get more detail in the manifesto when that comes forward.
A 5-year-old boy has died after falling from flats in East London. Police in Plaistow say it happened early this morning. This woman who lives in the block of flats has spoken to LBC.
From before 6 o'clock, I heard a man was screaming and crying. By 10 o'clock, I think a lady from council knocked to my door and she told me that he was a child. I was so shocked.
Slovakia's president-elect says the country's prime minister has very difficult hours and days ahead after being shot multiple times. Robert Fico is apparently able to talk, but his condition remains critical. US officials say a temporary pier to help deliver aid to Gaza has been anchored on the beach there. Humanitarian supplies are expected to arrive in days. Donald Trump's lawyers accused the star witness in his hush money trial of lying. Michael Cohen, Trump's former lawyer, claims he had a phone conversation with the former US president about payments to porn star Stormy Daniels, but the defence says that didn't happen. Well, Michael Wolff's written a book about the former president and thinks this trial could actually help his election campaign.
Again and again and again, over the course of 8 years, all of those things that we've looked at and said, well, this will derail him, this will surely finish him off, including losing an election. And it doesn't.
And Theresa May's joked that Liz Truss's new book should be filed under sci-fi and fantasy. The former Prime Minister also told reporters that Boris Johnson's upcoming memoir should be shelved under current affairs. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 7 points at 84.38. The pound buys $1.26 and €1.16. LBC weather, rain clearing the west this evening with many areas turning dry. Showers in the south also fading, although some continuing across northern England and southern Scotland, and a low of 4 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Ali Miraj.
Ali Miraj on LBC in for Ian Dale. It's 2 minutes past 9. And in this final hour, I've got to say, I've been looking forward to this all day because we're going to have a discussion about China. Now, why are we having a discussion about China? Well, for 2 reasons. One, I would say it's probably the biggest existential threat to the US at the moment, probably the most important one for 100 years, but that's just my view. We're going to be hearing from Rana Mitter in a minute what his view is, but also because Vladimir Putin is in China at the moment. He's visiting President Xi. They went to a concert together last night. It's all a bit of a love-in. President Putin, in his opening remarks, hailed Russia and China's economic ties and said their partnership was, and I quote, one of the main stabilizing factors in the international arena. And President Xi stressed the friendship between Moscow and Beijing and went on to say that Moscow and Beijing intend to increase interaction and tighten coordination in order to counter Washington's destructive and hostile course towards the so-called dual containment of our countries. I mean, it's not exactly leaving much to the imagination there. Now, China, huge opportunity, threat, many things you might think. And I think it's high time we had a deep discussion about it. And that is exactly why I'm delighted to say that Professor Rana Mitter is with me this evening. He's Professor of US-Asia Relations at Harvard University. He's an expert on contemporary Chinese politics and its modern history. And you can watch us on Global Player, by the way, so do tune in. Now, just to give you a bit of background, because that was really not to do Rana any justice whatsoever. He's written several books. He's won several awards, including a book, Forgotten Ally, China's World War II, which he won the 2014 Rusi Duke of Westminster's Medal for Military Literature. He also writes for a whole host of outlets, including Foreign Affairs, Harvard Business Review, The Spectator, and others. He's teaching at the Kennedy School at the moment. Rana, you obviously... by the way, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. You're teaching there. I only lasted one semester as an undergrad, so I didn't get too far, but I had a very good time. And it's very, very good to have you here. Rana, just to start, can you just paint the picture of how important China is in terms of its position in relation to the West at the moment?
Absolutely, Ali, and it's a huge pleasure to be with you here as well and to have this conversation. Really looking forward to this hour that we and the listeners have together. So right now, I would say that the primary objective on the minds of the Chinese Communist Party and its supreme leader, Xi Jinping, General Secretary of the party, President of China, Chairman of the Central Military Commission, he's got a whole bunch of other titles, but we won't do them all, otherwise we'll be here for the whole hour, is first and foremost to make sure that they stay in power in terms of their political mission. And so everything else they do with regard to the West or the wider world or at home is in service of that particular aim. And when we bear that in mind, I think it explains in some ways the quite ambivalent, quite complicated relationship they have with the Western world. So you might remember that today, as you were just saying, Xi Jinping is hosting Vladimir Putin, and it's middle of the night, I think, in Beijing, but tomorrow morning they'll no doubt have a power breakfast together. But last week, Xi Jinping was in Europe. He was in France visiting Macron. Then he went to Hungary, and then he went to Serbia. And part of the reason for that is that China doesn't trust the West to do right by China. They remember back, not personally, but certainly collectively, to the late 19th, early 20th century, a time when they remember the British and the French were involved in smashing open the doors of China to sell opium initially, but also to bring all sorts of dubious ideas like, liberal political thought and Christian missionaries, of course, into the country. And even though that's, long ago, well outside personal memory, it shapes the idea that the world is a hostile place and therefore China needs to be wary of it. And therefore part of the mission is to try and make sure that, if possible, the West does not speak with one voice. So that was the aim in going, for instance, to France, where they noted that President Macron had spoken more than once about strategic autonomy for Europe. In other words, maybe Europe ought to go it alone. And Xi Jinping was very keen to say, that's a great idea. That's something that you guys in Europe...
State visit he got there.
He got a very nice state visit. And we know that actually from when Macron visited Xi in Beijing. Macron freelanced a bit. He went off script and started, talking a little bit about issues, including trade, even a little bit about human rights. And I think Xi Jinping wasn't all that happy about it, but he let it ride because he wanted to come back to Europe and say, the West is not one thing, and maybe we can peel off the various actors. So in the end, the key goal is looking at Washington, looking at the United States, seeing Washington as the key adversary in the 2020s, 30s and beyond. Not necessarily in military terms, that's part of it, but also in terms of trade, commerce, international influence, and saying what can we in Beijing do to actually try and separate off other actors in the West, the Europeans in particular, to try and get them to sing from a slightly different hymn sheet.
Thank you, Rana, for outlining that. Now, my question to the audience this evening, to the listeners, is this, and it's just my question. I mean, you can make up your own question. It is a China hour. You can go take it where you want. My question to you is this. Is China an existential threat to the West? 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850. And you can ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. Now, Rana, when I look at China, I think about two things. I think about economic prowess and power, and I also think about military power. Now, on economic power, it seems to me that China has been very adept at doing two things. One, expanding its tentacles into supply chains globally over a period of years, to the extent that the West is now talking about friendshoring and reshoring and shortening supply chains. And that's why people are building gigafactories to make batteries for electric vehicles so they don't have to get them from China, why we are doing all sorts of things to shorten the supply chain. They also have been expanding their tentacles all over the global south, all over Africa, through a little thing called the Belt and Road, which has actually cost $1 trillion, and where the EU and the US are scrambling to compete for, let's just say, influence in the regions. Do you think that part of this is because China takes a much, much longer-term view to its policy-making and its position in the world than Western politicians whose time horizon is 4 or 5 years?
Because they have to worry about elections.
Yes.
So I would say a couple of things in response to that analysis, Ali, which has got a huge amount of, I think, nuance and power behind it. First of all, let's beware of words like tentacles, because obviously they've got a slightly dubious sort of sound. It could be an octopus, could be a squid. I don't know what it would be, but I would say that let's just talk about influence in that sense.
Yes.
So let's use an example. Supposing you're a newly emergent economy. You're Nigeria. You're Indonesia. You're one of these big growing countries with a young population. They need jobs. They need the economy to be stimulated. They want to be in that post-fossil fuel environment. They want to be connected to 5G. And they look around the world marketplace and they go to Washington, D.C. and they say, guys, what have you got to offer us? Indonesia in 15 years is going to be one of the 5 most populous countries in the world. Cut us a deal. And the answer is, look, we can send warships, we can give you security in the region because we don't want China dominating the seas in East Asia. But when it comes to a trade deal, sorry, the door is closed in Washington on that. The United Kingdom, of course, Ali, you know this very well, we've been trying to do a trade deal post-Brexit for some time. Not getting much change either from the Trump administration before or the Biden administration now. Instead, China comes along and they say the following things. Number one, we will offer you 5G lightning speed. We'll send out our best engineers to get it installed at, the fastest speed you could imagine, and your economy will be transformed. The only alternatives you've got are, European firms. There's Nokia, there's Ericsson, maybe Samsung out in South Korea. There is no American provider. I mean, think about this from a country that, won the Cold War. There is no American provider of 5G cyber that can actually compete with that Chinese offer. And even the Europeans are not at the moment in the same sort of category in terms of scale. So if you're Nigeria, if you're Indonesia, if you're one of these countries that needs economic progress now, then you're going to take that deal. Even if you're worried about the security, where's the data going to go when you put it through the system, it still means that your economy is going to be turbocharged by the technology you have in the here and now. But what it also means is when it comes to upgrades, when it comes to spare parts, when it comes to what political scientists like to call path dependency, you are then putting yourself in a position where, as you know, putting yourself in in the path of Chinese technology has to be deepened and continued. At the moment, the UK is trying to remove Huawei components from the system here. It's a very hard thing to do once you've installed the system there. That's what's going, I think, into the system.
Well, that's exactly right, and it's some way from where we had that sort of love-in between George Osborne and David Cameron some years ago to where we are now, where the hawks within the Conservative Party have moved the policy on China, particularly in relation to Huawei and its involvement in 5G, but also in terms of Chinese involvement in critical national infrastructure, be that Hinkley Point C or other things. To what extent, Rana, do you think that we have been a bit naive in our whole approach to China? China is a great power with a history going back thousands of years. They think in the long-term strategic view. They have a view of what they want to achieve. Do you think we've just simply been too starry-eyed about all this? And I think about, we talked about Cameron, we're now talking about Blair saying that there should be 3 approaches to China, 3 legs: competition, cooperation and confrontation, depending on which area you're dealing with.
Which China is going to look at and say, well, guys, you want to collaborate, that's fine. But you want to confront us, that's fine. But we're not going to play the game with you in that in that sense. China's going to get on with what it wants to do. Listen, earlier in the conversation, Ali, and this is something that listeners may want to call in on, you used the word existential. And that's a big word. Basically everything in a country's value system and a society's value system up for grabs. Cards on the table. I do not think China is that kind of threat. I think the existential threat is something that seems to have happened in the liberal world. I don't want to use the word Western world because, Japan is part of this. A lot of democratic countries and other parts of the world that aren't in Europe are part of this too, have lost their mojo a bit. They're not sure, today we have debates about, is democracy really working?
Yep.
You could argue that Russia and China are doing a bit, through cyber and so forth to try and subvert what's going on.
Yep.
But you and I know that actually the undermining elements in democratic politics come from within the societies themselves.
That's true.
Has to be dealt with. Linked to that, why aren't we innovating more? Why don't we have those big providers that provide the 5G or the post-fossil fuel technology, the solar panels that are actually going to fuel, excuse the pun, the next generation of energy transition? The other thing is, there's a great article by one of the great Washington, D.C. analysts of China, Ryan Haas, involved in both analysis and the administration. And he wrote a great essay called China is Not 10 Feet Tall. In other words, don't make China either out to be more than it is or less than it is. Let me give you a little secret about the Belt and Road Initiative that you mentioned earlier, this big infrastructure project that China's been running for about 15 years. Yeah. Basically, about 2 or 3 years ago, large parts of it turned out to be a complete bust when it turned to getting investment back. The government, and this includes Xi Jinping, we're pretty sure, looked at the numbers and said, Guys, you know, it turned out that high-speed railway between Kenya and Uganda, which was abandoned halfway through. I mean, you think we've got a problem with HS1. That was really a high-speed rail project went horribly wrong. And what's happened is that actually, without explicitly saying so, China has pulled back lots of those big non-transparent, opaque wodges of money that it was handing out to many of these projects in the global south, what we used to call the third world.
Yes.
And instead it's now insisting actually that the private sector sticks to areas where it knows what it's doing best, which is 5G, certain amount on vaccines and pharmaceuticals. That's a big area where China wants to expand. And post-fossil fuel green technology, because it thinks those are the technologies of the future. So the question is the liberal world, is the UK, the US, Europe, going to compete on those terms, or are they going to hold over those marks and say, you know, China, you've won already?
There's so much to unpick there, and you mentioned some of the areas that they're focusing on. I think about the China Made in China 2025 strategy, where they identify certain key areas, be it AI, be it EV charging, whatever these things are, where they want to lead. And also on the Belt and Road, it hasn't all worked out their own way, because a lot of countries are becoming increasingly indebted to China. And you saw what happened at Hanbatota port in Sri Lanka, where people were up in arms and there were riots going on because of what the government had done in that. Look, so many calls and texts already coming in. My question is China an existential threat to the West? But you may have your own questions. We've got 45 minutes to go, and I'm going to start taking your calls right after the break. You are listening to Ali Miraj in conversation with Professor Rana Mitter in Fort Dale on LBC. It's 9:16.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast on LBC.
Hundreds of court hearings have been postponed at the last minute after ministers introduced emergency measures to deal with overcrowded jails. Susan Sevenoaks.
I work in the family court proceedings. To sit there and say, oh, it's a prison, why they're holding back? They're holding back because they don't have the magistrate. The whole justice system is completely broken.
Steve's in Sutton.
There are a growing number of people in this country who just want to do whatever it is that they want to do. The only way that everyone else gets to be protected from them is when they're locked up.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back this morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player, LBC. Leading Britain's conversation, LBC with Ali Miraj.
You're listening to Ali Miraj on LBC in conversation with Rana Mitter, Professor Rana Mitter from Harvard. We're talking about China. I'm asking you if China is an existential threat to the West, but you can ask any question you want on China, its relation with Britain, the West, anything you like. This is your chance. 0345 606 0973. Text 84850 or ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. The calls are already flying in. Diane in Stevenage, good evening.
Hi, Ali.
What would you like to ask?
I listen to you regularly, and your discussions always around war. I feel that you get a sense, you get something from it. Is it so?
Well, I mean, I do think that we are living in a very, very uncertain geopolitical time. Yes, I mean, it's not me getting some kick out of talking about war. There is a war going on the eastern flank of Europe right now, and there is also a potential war that might take part in the South China Sea at some point. Rana, I'm talking about Taiwan, and Loz has actually texted in on this, saying, how realistic are worries about military exchange between the US and China over Taiwan? Diane, I'll bring you back in a minute. Rana.
Actually, I hope I can give Diana and some others some reassuring news on this. My judgment is that actually the prospect of military confrontation between the US, Japan, its allies, and China over Taiwan is actually quite low at the moment. So the reasons for that are this. It is very clear that ever since 1949, the Communist Revolution, which brought Chairman Mao Zedong, to power, and the Communist Party has been in power ever since, of course, in China, that they regard Taiwan as the last unfinished business of the Cold War, unifying the island of Taiwan, the only part of traditional China that wasn't unified, with the mainland, has become a key political goal. But for a long time, it was kept very much on the back burner. Slightly over 50 years ago, 52 years ago, President Nixon, Richard Nixon, visited China. He met Chairman Mao. And amongst other things, Mao said, well, the Taiwan problem is real, but we can put it on the back burner for 100 years. Well, they didn't wait 100 years, but they waited about 50. Recently, Xi Jinping has given public speeches saying the Taiwan issue, meaning unification, cannot be left to the next generation. But I think it's too simplistic to suggest that actually that means that a war, in terms of a kind of all-out military conflict between the two sides, is the most likely scenario. Two reasons for that. The first one, and I'm sorry, Diana, this is talking a bit about war, but I hope it'll be good news for you because it's about why I think it's less likely to happen. The military tactics involved in invading Taiwan would first of all be very, very visible from satellites and so forth, and secondly, are really hard to do. You would have to have a simultaneous air, amphibious, and East Coast invasion of Taiwan because of the nature of its topography and beaches. There's a reason that you can only name a very small number of successful amphibious campaigns in the 20th century. D-Day, Iwo Jima, Incheon during the Korean War, maybe you know a few more, Ali, but that's kind of my list done, because they're really hard to do. So if you're China's political thinkers, you think, well, what else can I do to try and get to that goal? And the two answers that come to mind, one is that China has a tremendous amount of economic coercive power over Taiwan. 80% of Taiwan's businesses are actually linked to the mainland in some way. They tried to diversify, but it hasn't been all that successful. The second thing is that there are an awful lot of younger Taiwan voters, as well as older ones, who do feel alienated from the mainland. They don't really feel that they're Chinese. But there are an awful lot of people who also feel that if for some reason they felt the United States weren't going to support them, then they might actually end up having to do some sort of deal with China. And that's the feeling that I don't think it's very likely right now, but it's the kind of thing that China would like to encourage in terms of what you might call sort of information warfare.
Understood. But then, sorry, Dana, go ahead.
Ali,
Dan.
what my thinking is,
go on.
I think a lot the West spends its time hollowing out the resources of other countries, whereas I see China as a country who goes around and builds infrastructure. Why don't the West take a different approach? I think that they try to find another war to fight all the time, as opposed to building countries so that their people don't have to be escaping to come to England and they're running them out. Why not take a different approach that the approach that China is taking?
Diane, just briefly, just on that, do you think that it is all benign on the part of China, or do you think it is actually because they want to spread their economic influence and are using infrastructure as a tool of international affairs and foreign policy?
It might be, Ali. It might be, but look at the West. The West goes in other countries. They haul out their resources and not building the infrastructure of those countries. Think they were doing like what China is doing now.
Okay.
Wouldn't they be more revered around the world?
Well, it's an interesting point, and in fact, to your particular point, it is actually very timely, Diane, your observation, because the Commissioner for International Partnerships for the EU, Jutta Urpilainen, has actually been talking about the fact that the EU is struggling to counter China's influence in the global south. It's an interesting observation. Let's go to our next call from Matthew in London Bridge. Matthew, good evening.
Hi, mate. You're right. It's a bit random, and I don't sound like I'm from the manor. My dad was on tour with the Gurkhas. I was born in Hong Kong,
Right.
and I was out there for about 2 years. And what I witnessed was, and I vividly remember it, basically like a sweatshop. But it almost seems to me, if the cap fits, you wear it, because a lot of stuff, when you look at the labels on your clothes and all that, it says made in China. So it's almost like, I don't know, it's like a conflict of interest. It's almost in terms of, you know what I mean? Like, if the cap fits, you wear it, but it's like, well, we're making money. Like, it's all about like the greater good, right?
Okay,
so, it's almost nonsensical in terms of like, well, hold up, we can't go to war or we can't get involved in that because financially, as a country, we need them to make sustainable profit.
You have hit you've hit a very important point on the head there, Rana.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, actually, those labels saying made in China, Matt, that you've seen there, they're beginning to disappear. One of the reasons is that as China has moved over the last 15, 20 years from being a very poor country to being a middle-income country, as has happened in other countries that got richer, those very low-level sweatshop type jobs that you've talked about there, which were very much a reality, they still are in many places in China, but a lot less than previously, because as people get richer, they want higher wages and they demand better conditions. That's happened in China too. So in fact, a lot of those really cheap manufacturers, clothes, shoes and so forth, have gone to elsewhere in Asia. They've gone to Vietnam, they've gone to Cambodia. They've even gone actually to the areas that Ali was mentioning earlier is as part of this wider Belt and Road Initiative, like Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa are places where the Chinese get their shoes. So there's actually a whole category of people in China who are the equivalent of Donald Trump voters because they are furious, not that China has stolen their jobs, but that Ethiopia and Vietnam have stolen their jobs. And that is a genuine constituency you can see on social media in China saying how dare they do that. The flip side is that what China's doing now, and this is the strategy, is to get much more central to the global supply chains of those new tech value-added jobs. And that's really where the competition of the 2020s and 2030s is going to be fought as we move towards the Internet of Things, as we move towards a world where actually the manufacture of semiconductor chips is going to be, some people are calling that the new oil. And in some ways, that's where China is winning out. So in those terms, I think it's fair to say that although we make several significant efforts to try and move production out of China because of the risk of a potential conflict, just take one brief example of why it's difficult. Apple. One of, lots of listeners are going to have an iPhone in their pocket. And in some ways, Apple is a Chinese company because it produces so much of the components and its manufacture in China. Now, some of that's been moved into India, a bit into Vietnam. But even so, there are very few, there's nowhere else on earth that has the scale, the trained labour and the capacity to be able to produce iPhones in that way. And that's a real problem in terms of saying, well, we won't deal with China anymore.
Absolutely. David in Uxbridge, good evening.
Good evening, Ali, and good evening, Rana, sorry. My thought and then my question to you is really that I think we often do a lot of analysis of China, but we don't really do analysis of the American position. And my view of the American position is it never tolerates any kind of peer, competitor. And now you get, and I think it's primarily feared of the economic power of China to threaten its domination. Like you had Biden tweeting there that he's going to put 100% tariffs on EVs and solar panels. And my thing is, why would Europe, is it in Europe's interest? Like China's producing this electric car and it's going to retail about 25 grand and it's far better than Tesla. Should we not be getting these cars in? And the solar panels, if we're going to, the big threat is climate change, not China.
David, thank you. Thank you. David's alighted on the old question of US hegemony and the threat to US hegemony and what happens when you're moving towards, as China wants, a more multipolar world than a unipolar world.
Well, I think one of the things that the United States, at its best, and that is very frequent, does do, is to try and maintain an international order in which essentially most of the actors have as much autonomy as possible. When you ask American allies, and actually neutral states in the Asia-Pacific region, what it is that they're concerned about when they see the rise of China, it's not particularly that so much of their market and economics is linked to China, because it's a huge market, lots of people want to buy, that makes a lot of sense economically. It's the fear that by having that indebtedness to China in a wider sense, that they will no longer be free to sail their ships where they want, to sell their goods where they want, to have the kind of choices that they have at the moment. And to be fair, in recent years, it's fair to say that the American security presence in the Asia-Pacific has actually enabled countries like Japan, like South Korea, like Singapore, like Thailand, like the Philippines, to actually exercise more autonomy in that sense. So that's where the fear and the contrast come from. And without the US power that exists in East Asia as a balance to China, both countries are always going to be there and going to have to be there. And even the Chinese acknowledge that. They've said that the Pacific is big enough for, more than one actor. Many of those smaller countries that want China's market would feel much more unsafe in that sense. The question, as I've said, I think is really about technology in the next few years. In other words, is there going to be an American-backed or non-Chinese-backed technological alternative on everything from green energy to cyber and 5G?
Yes.
And if the answer to that is no, then actually I think that's a real problem, Ali, for the West and the liberal world.
Yep.
You can't really blame China for doing well, even though, of course, they are using state subsidies to produce. But America is still the most innovative economy in the world when it comes to blue skies research. It's the question of getting that into scalable economic use, which was so good at during the Cold War.
Yes.
That needs to come back.
Thank you very much indeed, Ron. And what a fascinating conversation this is. I knew it would be, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it. I hope you are too. China is such a big topic to cover. Get your calls in now. Anything and everything you want to discuss, international affairs, the economic aspects of it, the military aspects, the security aspects, all of it is on the table. 0345 6060 You can also text on 84850. Ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. You're listening to Ali Miraj in for Ian Dale in conversation with Professor Rana Mitter on LBC at 9:31. The news headlines with Daryl Jackson.
The Tories have accused Labour of being devoid of any plan for Britain. So Keir Starmer's announced his first steps if his party wins a general election, but some claim they're scaled-back promises he's already made. Teachers of a 5-year-old boy have laid flowers outside a tower block in East London where he fell to his death. Police were called to the 15th floor of the building in Plaistow early this morning. A man has been charged with attempted murder after Slovakia's Prime Minister was shot yesterday. Robert Fico is said to have survived the attack by just a hair. LBC weather, rain clearing central England and Wales this evening and a low of 4 degrees.
This is LBC. leading Britain's conversation with Ali Miraj. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
Ali Miraj on LBC, it's 9:34. I'm in conversation with Professor Rana Mitter from Harvard. We're talking China. 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. Ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. Now, it's interesting because, Rana, you and I, the last time we saw each other, and we do fairly often, was at Ditchley in Oxfordshire when we were both listening to Bill Burns, the director of the CIA, talking about some of the threats, particularly cyber. And here, only in the last few days, the head of GCHQ, Anne Keast Butler, has said that she's devoting more resources to China than any other single mission, and said China is increasingly working with others to try and reshape the world, and talked about an epoch-defining challenge when it comes to cybersecurity in the UK in particular. And this comes just a few days after there was a revelation about a hack at the Ministry of Defence payroll system. How important and how big a challenge is cybersecurity when it comes to China?
It's one of the most important and fast developing areas actually in terms of security in general. I think most of the Western powers, when they look at intelligence issues, look at China, Russia, North Korea and Iran as being the actors against there's the most action that is taken. The question that comes up is, what is it that China and other actors are seeking to do in terms of those sorts of cyber attacks? Because I think the aims, actually, of those different countries are somewhat different. In terms of Russia, it's very difficult to obviously tell what motivations are, but some of it is actually to do with that wider sense of wanting to destroy the existing order. I think that's not so much what's going on in China, because China has actually a very vested interest in many aspects of this existing order remaining quite stable, but becoming much more heavily influenced by priorities that China has. For instance, moving much more to the idea that individual countries have, what they call cyber sovereignty and can essentially do what they want within their space. So in that sense, I think that if you want a sort of one-word answer to what's going on, I think the word is data. I think the idea in the Chinese system is that the more data you can gather about not only what's happening in China, and by the way, if you go to China these days, obviously huge amounts of data will be collected for the wider population in terms of swiping their phones when they travel on the subway or when they're ordering a taxi, whatever it might be, which adds up to a huge kind of menu of data, but also for overseas, being able to put as much, if we think about the development of artificial intelligence, and that's probably, again, one of the cutting-edge areas where China is looking to dominate technology in the next few years. To make AI work well, you need as much raw data as possible. And if you gather it from a whole variety of different societies, including US, UK, you've got more capacity to build better AI.
Understood. Vincent in Glasgow, good evening.
Good evening. I'd like to make a comment and then ask a quick question.
Please.
I don't consider China an existential threat to the people of Great Britain. In fact, I think the current leadership of the Anglo-American world a bigger threat to the common good of the population of this country. I see the West as bankrupt of any real economic initiative. They care more about the stock market than national economies and the common good, whereas China is investing in domestic and international infrastructure. So my question is, Putin said, and here's a quote from Putin, 2014, he said that the unipolar world is simply a means of justifying Anglo-American supremacy and dictatorship over weaker nations. Now, this is my question. If this isn't the case, what is the unipolar world? And why is it in the interests of the common good of the population of the UK that the international order be pegged to a multi-polar world as opposed to an Anglo-American unipolar world?
Thank you very much, Vincent. Also, just to chuck in one thought from me, Rana. It was not so long ago that I bumped into Francis Fukuyama with his book a couple of years ago.
You hang out in the nicest places, obviously. Ali.
Yeah, Liberalism and its Discontents. He was really talking about the primacy of liberalism being challenged by autocratic capitalism. What are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I'm going to lay it on the table here for you and the listeners, but I think liberalism is a good thing, particularly when you consider the alternative, but we have to work out how to preserve it and keep it lively. I think that it's fair to say that there was something like a unipolar world, that American domination maybe 25, 30 years ago. I'm really not convinced about that now. Just let me use one example because it concerns China, and I think that illustrates the point. In the year 2000, which I think probably still counts as being in that broad unipolar moment, it was before 9/11, it was before the kind of real turbulence of the 21st century got going, pretty much every single country in the Asia-Pacific region had the United States as its major trading partner.
Yes.
Every single one of those same countries now has China as its major trading partner. And in terms of integration of trade, something like the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which basically is a low-level but wide-ranging free trade deal that basically gives access to China's market, that's something where China's in the driving seat. And yet, if you look at the security of the region, you'll find that all of those actors, including countries that see themselves as being politically a bit on the fence, someone like Indonesia, nonetheless are very keen that the United States should not leave the region in terms of the naval and military presence that it provides. That's not a unipolar world. That's a world where one story is emerging about security, and, as Vincent Glasgow is saying, this is, partly about whether or not the US can continue to maintain its presence in that area, but one where the economic power of China, particularly in its own backyard, is becoming stronger and stronger. So that's not about one power exercising unlimited or unquestioned power. It's very much about the tension between the two sides.
Interesting. Thank you. Grace and Ealing, good evening.
Hi, good evening. I'm really concerned about China and potentially Russia as well exploiting the global south. I'm generally very concerned about the most severe poverty in our world and exploitation where it exists. And obviously, people and institutions from our part of the world have historically done horrific things in the global south, and that's part of the reason that we are richer than some other countries. I'm really worried that the global south may be somewhat recolonized by China and Russia, and people in the global south are to some extent quite happy for Russia and China to be sinking their claws in because it seems that they're bringing benefits, but I'm worried about nefarious intent, and I don't know what the thoughts are about the trajectory of that.
Grace raises an interesting point. Rana, is it a fair exchange for infrastructure for resources, or is it all being done with nefarious intent?
Okay, so I think Grace asks a really good question, not least because it, I think, reflects the concerns and fears, frankly, that many people around the world have. But let me try and get what I hope will be a reasonable answer to that. First of all, it's fair to say that I don't think China does any of the infrastructure spending, the investment that it does, simply for altruistic reasons. The kind of simple donations of foreign aid, which we know about from the UK, from the US and so forth, which is still actually a very large part of the West budget, and that shouldn't be underestimated. China doesn't do very many of those. It doesn't do none, but it doesn't do very many. And one of the reasons you have to remember is that per capita, China is still a much poorer country than most of the countries of the rich West. So when it invests as a loan, which is then expected to be paid back. And in some cases, those loans have worked out badly and been pretty exploitative. Zambia would be a good example of a country which I think, not least because of bad investments in the copper belt, has ended up in a very difficult situation in terms of debt. And, there's no arguing with that. However, take another example. If you wanted to travel now from Jakarta to Bandung, two of the major cities of Indonesia, as I mentioned before, one of the major emerging markets that desperately needs new investment, jobs for young people, and infrastructure built. You can now zip between the two in a matter of, hours, as opposed to much longer than it used to be, because of a high-speed rail system, which was built essentially with Chinese spending and Chinese money. And that has been, I made the joke about HS1 before, but this is an example not of a failure, but as a success. People in Indonesia don't expect the Chinese to do that sort of thing out of charity, and it's not a charity, it's basically an investment which is supposed to make a return. But it does do something in terms of building in infrastructure, which then creates new economic opportunities in terms of transportation between the two sides. One other quick example from the same region. If you go to Malaysia, one of the biggest growing companies is Proton, which is a small electric vehicle manufacturer. And for a country in Southeast Asia which is still growing its economy, that kind of manufacturing is really important. The intellectual property, the batteries and the investment, a lot of the foreign direct investment, FDI, comes straight from China. Now, if the wider world doesn't want China to invest in the EV industry in Malaysia, that's fine. Others can come in and invest as well. But right now the Malaysians are saying, well, where is that money? Where is the check from somewhere else? We're not taking Chinese money because we're deeply in love with Beijing. It's because they're the offer that's on the table.
That is. And if you look at what they've done with the likes of Pakistan as well for many, many years, they're investing in Gwadar Port. It's a huge thing. Well, it's interesting, though, Rana, because of that. Just on that Pakistan point for a second. I mean, I've always thought that China was trying to cozy up to Pakistan in the region to try and influence or to establish its sort of regional hegemony in its own backyard. But it actually seems to also have a little bit of a détente going on, a loving going on with India at the moment.
What, China?
Yeah.
I think that there's something to that, actually. I mean, there was, of course, a deadly clash between the two sides in the Galwan Valley up in the Himalayas in 2020. And that was the first time, actually, there'd been fatalities between the two sides for many decades. And I think both sides thought, whoa, and kind of stepped back a little bit from that. But I think that Modi and Xi Jinping, Narendra Modi and Xi Jinping, both see themselves as shapers of that new world, the world that Dave up in Glasgow, I think, was talking, Vince, sorry, in Glasgow was talking about. And whether they'll succeed or not is another matter.
Yes.
But they certainly think that actually, let's just take one quote from Mr. Jaishankar, the foreign minister of India. I think at one point one of the Americans asked him, whose side are you on, the West or China's? And he said, neither, we're on ours. I think that's a very important
He
dynamic.
also made the point at the Munich Security Conference that smart allies offer smart choices and smart people make smart choices. There you go.
Nice
Thank
line.
you.
Nice
Thank you
line.
very much indeed, Rana. This is going fascinating. We've still got about 15 minutes for this conversation with Professor Rana Mitter. You know what to do. 0345 6060 973. We're discussing all things China. You can text on 84850. Ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. You're listening to Ali Miraj in conversation with Professor Rana Mitter on LBC. It's 9:45.
This is LBC.
Make them.
Ali Miraj on LBC. Text 84850.
Ali Miraj on LBC in conversation with Professor Rana Mitter, Professor of US-Asia Relations at Harvard University. We're discussing all things related to China. 0345 6060 973. Jeff will come to your call in a moment. You're in Munich. Just hold on. But first, Zach from Shepherd's Bush via Alexa has asked this. What is Rana's opinion on the Uyghur situation? Rana.
Well, this is the abuse of human rights of the Uyghurs, an ethnic minority, of course, Chinese citizens in the west of China, Xinjiang region, who were essentially being held in what were termed re-education camps. This is in the late 2010s in particular. I mean, various reporters, but I think we should give a shout out actually to John Sudworth of the BBC, who was, I think, on the ground at the time and did a lot of very tough reporting that, the Chinese authorities did not like about this subject. I think it's fair to say that coverage at this issue has become a little harder to find in the last year or two. And the sense, and this is something, of course, from the outside, it's just very difficult to tell, is that maybe that particular phase is no longer where that particular policy is going, because actually a lot of analysts would say that in terms of surveillance, using face recognition, AI and so forth, Xinjiang has become a sort of test ground for the ability to use cameras and other means to actually trace people. In other words, you don't need to confine them, because actually people will know where you are. They recognize your number plates, they recognize your face, that sort of thing. At the same time, China is also, I think, pushing hard to try in the United Nations to use institutions such as the Human Rights Council to change definitions of what human rights are. At the moment, we still have a very strong concentration on what I think in the West and, in Japan and elsewhere, we consider to be the key definition, which is individual civil liberties. China is pushing very hard on the idea that economic well-being and collective good and well-being, and people essentially having, as they put it, the right to eat, the first human right, that's their phrase, is much more central. So they're looking, I think, in a sense, to change the conversation about human rights as a whole. And of course, with many allies in the global south, including countries that are keen to essentially perhaps get financial aid or other kinds of assistance from China, they have quite a lot of help in that particular conversation.
Thank you very much, Rana. Jeff in Munich in Germany, good evening.
Yeah, good evening.
What would you like to ask, Jeff?
Yeah, what I'd like to say is we're afraid of China, but what we actually should be doing is, making friends in the region of those countries that China is concerned or afraid of.
Okay. Yeah, Jeff, can I ask you something just on the relation to that? Do you think it's sensible for the US to be sending a delegation to mark the inauguration of the new president of Taiwan?
I have no opinion on that. But
okay.
What I wanted to say is that the bulwark, the basis in Southeast Asia that China is very concerned about is Vietnam.
Okay.
And Vietnam is, a power that if the West invests in Vietnam, would be a very, very good, bulwark against everything.
We get the picture. Rana.
Yeah, I mean, Vietnam is an interesting country because, as you say, it's actually built up a lot of relations with the West, particularly the US, which is deeply ironic considering the war that the US fought with Vietnam in the 60s and 70s. But it also still has actually a strong relationship with China. There are Communist Party to Communist Party links between Hanoi and Beijing, which are still quite strong in certain ways. I don't think we should be afraid of China. I don't think we should be afraid of anything as long as we have confidence in our own values and systems. What we can do confidently, I think, if we want to talk to China, is to find out more about the place, learn the language, learn the history, learn the culture, and then be able to go and talk about where we disagree strongly, if respectfully, on human rights, on trade, on other issues, and say, we want to take a different point of view, not because we're afraid of you, but because we genuinely, from an informed position, take a strong and principled position that's different from yours. And we want to be in dialogue about that. But we don't step back from our values, even if you're not to step back from yours.
But doesn't that also mean, Ron, that you don't go out of your way to go and antagonize people in their own backyard? I mean, Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan, the US sending some sort of delegation to this presidential inauguration in Taiwan. I mean, this is a red rag to a Chinese bull, isn't it?
Well, I think that certainly the effort to try and make gesture politics that actually lots of people in Taiwan found, deeply annoying or deeply anger-making is not a good idea. And it's actually notable that Kevin McCarthy, the Republican Speaker of the House who followed Nancy Pelosi and then lost his job in rather spectacular circumstances, actually, very sensibly, it seems, decided not to go to Taiwan, even though he was thinking of doing that. And both sides need to understand where you are pragmatic at the same time as keeping your principles.
Well, I'm an old realist in foreign policy. I think about things of old-fashioned concepts like spheres of influence and the balance of
You're
power.
the new Henry Kissinger,
well,
Ali. What can I say?
You've got to fly the flag.
Maybe you could do the accent.
Someone's got to fly the flag. Amjad in Leeds, good evening.
Hi, good evening. What a fantastic program you two guys are putting together. I'm enjoying it. I've got a question. My father came to this country and worked at the wool mills. At that time, in the late 50s and 60s, we were the global powerhouse of manufacturing. Sadly, we've lost that manufacturing, and China is now the global player as far as manufacturing is concerned. How do we reinvigorate ourselves in this country to once again become a manufacturing powerhouse? I'm not saying with the wool industry or the cotton industry or the dye works that was around that. What I'm saying with the new industries, what can we learn from the Chinese?
Basically, we've got to do a bit more than banking, law and accountancy.
China for the last 15 years, great question, Arjun, thank you for that. China for the last 15, 20 years has been spending 2.4% of its GDP on research and development. And it's shown in the number of science, technology, maths graduates produced year by year. I think it's not the only answer, but part of the answer to your question, I think, is about producing manufacturers and industries that work with the new technologies. China's doing that. There's no reason with a well-educated population and a liberal, open society we shouldn't do even better.
Thank you so much. Amjad, really good question, and thanks for dialing in. Isaac in Heston, good evening.
Good evening. Right, I want to back up what a lady caller said earlier, and a couple of callers just said now. What we in the West should be doing, we should be following China's lead. For example, instead of exploiting various countries, poor countries around the world for their resources, we should be investing in their economies, in like infrastructure and this, that, and the other. To keep these countries on side, because it seems to me China is offering them very good, trade deals. And we in the West are offering nothing.
Okay,
right?
Isaac, yeah, it's a fair point. Go on, Rana.
No, I think that's so, Isaac. I take your point, but I think that's too simple. First of all, an awful lot of the majority of FDI, foreign direct investment that's coming into large parts of the global South, is still from the wider Western world. It's from Japan. It's from new actors like Turkey as well. And the World Bank is also an important lender in terms of development projects. We really shouldn't think that China is dominating, because it's not. The other side is that China, while it does do a lot of investment that does real good, I mentioned those high-speed railways a moment ago, and there are other examples, nonetheless also is very happy to exploit mineral resources in places like Democratic Republic of the Congo and elsewhere, where they want to get control of various rare earths. So I think we shouldn't portray one side as being purely virtuous and the other sides as simply motivated by selfishness. Yeah. Both sides have their own complexities.
Is it modern colonialism, Rana?
I think that colonialism isn't the most useful term to use. I think the question of, I used the term before, I'll use it again as we come near the end, path dependency, trying to use technology to essentially get people to follow your norms, and then basically meaning that once they've done that, it's much harder to step back.
Okay. Kwame in Gillingham, good evening.
Hi, good evening. So my question is China doing anything the UK is not doing in respect of everything cyber and espionage?
Rana.
Fortunately, I'm not in a position in an expert way to comment on the espionage activities of any country, and certainly not the UK or China. As a historian of China, I stay well away from that. I think it's fair to say, from what we know, that espionage activity, which lots of countries do, including, of course, China, is not restrained by sort of, independent bodies and the judiciary in China, which is all under the control of the Communist Party. I think the expectation would be in the UK that at least the courts and the government can step in if they think things are going too far. But part of the point of intelligence work, of course, is that the wider public will rarely know what's going on.
Simon in Edgware, good evening.
Very quickly, yes. Two, three things that haven't been mentioned. First of all, the relationship regarding Iran, and of course the dangers there, particularly with Iran's nuclear facilities or attempting to build nuclear weapons.
Yep.
Also the belt and race policy we've spoken about, not just about economic reasons. I think we also have to look at the fact that China has engrossed themselves with different army bases, military bases and naval bases, which they use to pressure those countries. Okay. They've done it in Zimbabwe, they've done it in Jamaica and many other countries. Okay. Also, the Hinkley Power Station,
yes,
we should never have signed up to, because you're allowing Chinese technology, and in relationship with North Korea. So there are quite a few other things.
Quite a few other things.
Great danger.
Very brief observation, Rana, very quickly.
Thanks to Simon for a great new phrase. I will think of the Belt and Road policy as the Belt and Braces policy from now on. That's a great new phrase. I think it's fair to say that China, of course, plays geopolitics, and that's to be expected. We have to work out in the liberal world how we we play geopolitics that is smart in our interest.
Thank you so much, Rana. That was fascinating. I hope you enjoyed it, all of you, as much as I did. That was Professor Rana Mitter, Professor of US Asia Relations at Harvard University. Thank you so much for your time this evening and for making time in your very busy schedule for us. Thanks for all your calls and messages this evening. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Last 3 hours been very, very good fun. As always, I'll be back tomorrow from 7. Coming up at 1 on LBC, it's Clive Bull. But right now, here's the man, Ben Kentish.
Ali, thank you very much indeed, sir. Hello, good evening. Coming up.
With patience, with determination, with these first steps, we can rebuild our country with Labour.
Keir Starmer sets out his top priorities for a Labour government after the next general election. In a big speech in Essex this morning, the Labour's leader making 6 pledges that he said he would seek to fulfil early in his term as Prime Minister. A mood of change in the air, a Labour would-be PM promising to rebuild Britain, and even